Oh, hello, welcome back. I'm Kris. You know that, maybe not. This is episode 6 of the American Revolutionary series, American Revolution documentary from Kings and Generals. Cornwallis enters the fray. Go ahead. If you could do this for me, don't look at me. Look, see the mouse? Yeah, look at. Oh. Isn't that nice? I haven't even seen the video. I don't even know what this video is about. But I'm giving a thumbs up because it's Kings and Generals and I always appreciate it. You can do that for me. That would help me out tremendously. You can also subscribe and then click the bell because that's what you're supposed to do, they say. And then if you would like to donate to the channel, you can hit the thanks button. I said it in another video. But let's say you wanted me to do this. It would say Kris Reacts and then your name, sponsored, Cornwallis enters the fray, and then this probably would have to be left off because I only have 100 characters. Okay, we get the gist of everything. Any and everything is appreciated. So let's get into this video. I'm going to do one part. We'll do a little bit here. I'll bump it forward to there, and then it'll be under 25. Well, this will probably be a 30-minute video if I keep talking. So let's go.
On November 26, 1778, a British force of 3,000 men, led by Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, left New York on a southward trajectory, its destination unknown. It reappeared on December 23rd outside Savannah, Georgia, near Tybee Island. Campbell was under orders to meet with a detachment moving north from East Florida, but seeing the defenses at Tybee as weak, he decided to attack immediately. On the 29th,
Tybee Island is supposed to be a really nice vacation island. I've never been, but I want to go. Just if you want to pay for my trip, that'd be, I won't argue against it.
He landed at Girardeau's plantation, just south of Savannah. After being guided through the swamps by a local slave, the British surprised and routed the 850 Continental defenders. 453 prisoners were taken, and with them Savannah itself. It was the opening salvo of the final chapter of the American Revolution, the Southern Campaign. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We find you. The shift in focus to the southern states made slavery relevant to the war. Slavery was legal and recognized throughout the British Empire, but not in Britain itself. The King's Bench ruled in the 1772 case Somerset v. Stuart that, quote, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law, and it is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law." Slavery had never been codified in England, so it didn't exist there. Moreover, Scotland would rule similarly a few years later. However, since Britain's overseas colonies had codified slavery, the dubious institution did exist on those shores. Before and during the American Revolution, African slaves in the British Empire were primarily concentrated in the Caribbean colonies, with the Southern American colonies a distant second. Chattel slavery only made economic sense on large cash crop agriculture plantations, and those only worked in warm climates. The plantations of the southern United States and the Caribbean were the ideal vehicle for slaveholding. In contrast, while slaves were present in the northern colonies, their mercantile economies precluded widespread slaveholding. The attitude of both the British and Americans towards Africans, enslaved or free, was complicated. Many religious institutions and Enlightenment scholars regarded slavery as immoral, with the Quakers being particularly vocal in their contempt for the practice. Consequently, many educated Americans and Europeans strongly disliked the institution, but it was also regarded as an economic necessity, and immediate emancipation had little support. Many instead favored gradual emancipation, in which slavery would be gradually phased out, with financial compensation provided for the slave owners. George Washington's attitude towards slavery encapsulates these contradictions. Born a slaveholder in a slaveholding society, he grew up accepting slavery as a matter of course. As he grew older, he began regarding slavery as evil, publicly denouncing the slave trade. He initially resisted allowing black freedmen to serve in the Continental Army, but gradually accepted them, and black patriots more generally, sometimes looking the other way when runaway slaves were sheltered in the ranks. Ultimately, between 5,000 to 9,000 black Americans would serve in the army. At the same time, Washington jealously guarded his own slaves and aggressively sought to recover runaways.
He also, when he was president, the capital was in Philadelphia. This is forward 1789. And Philadelphia had a rule that if you were a slave and your slave master owner, slave master stayed in Philadelphia for over, I want to say it was 6 months. And you as a slave, you lived there for 6 months. After 6 months and a day, or 6 months, at that midnight, you were a free man or free woman. That was their rule. You stay in a free city, you became free at 6 months. And I like Washington, but the one thing that he did was he didn't want to lose his slaves. So at like 3-4 months, maybe 5 months, they would rotate the slaves back down to Mount Vernon so that they could be with their family. Never once telling them why they were doing it. He's doing it because he wanted to protect his slaves. He wanted to keep them. So that's, one of those things. And they would rotate, and then they would bring up new slaves just so they could experience everything. And it's garbage.
Paradoxical attitude was present on both sides before and during the war. However, the shift to the South, where slavery defined the economy, brought it to the forefront. There was a bitter irony in the British decision to shift southward in 1778. The British had failed in the northern states, in part thanks to London's refusal to believe how sparse support for the crown actually was. The long crisis, focused on New England, had heavily drained the region of loyalists prior to 1775. The circumstances surrounding the war's outbreak had further depleted them to nearly nothing. However, in the southern colonies, loyalism had been relatively high, validating British assumptions. Many southern planters had strong ties to the British aristocracy. Moreover, the southern colonies were also strongly connected, both culturally and economically, to the British Caribbean colonies. Many backcountry communities, particularly German and Scottish immigrants, remained loyal due to the British protecting them from persecution at home and keeping the native Cherokee tribes on their doorstep placated. Consequently, when hostilities broke out in April of 1775, the Carolinas and Georgia hadn't immediately thrown in with Massachusetts. As the youngest colony, Georgia had the closest ties to the mother country that even its patriots were loath to sever. Thus it was the last to join the Continental Congress and retained its royal governor, James Wright, until January 1776. Meanwhile, Georgia's northern neighbors had house cleaning to do. In Virginia, Governor Lord Dunmore had resisted the Patriots, first by handing over supply caches to the Royal Navy, and then by raising loyalist militia against them. When his efforts to raise this militia resulted in a low turnout, he'd issued a proclamation emancipating any Patriot-owned slave who joined his forces. While this did lead to between 800 and 2,000 slaves joining his cause, Dunmore was driven from mainland Virginia in January 1776 by overwhelming Patriot numbers. Thereafter, he fled to the Chesapeake Islands. Meanwhile, in the Carolinas, the coastal communities were overwhelmingly Patriot, but the interior leaned slightly loyalist. Tensions between these two opposing communities rose during the summer of 1775, with violence finally breaking out in September. The ensuing conflict, remembered as the Snow Campaign, saw thousands of militia on both sides turn out to fight. The better-led and organized Patriots rapidly dispersed the Loyalist militia and arrested most of their leaders, ending the threat by January. Surviving Loyalists would join with the Cherokee in attacking the Carolinas in 1776, only to be crushed by the militia response. Had the British provided sufficient support to either Loyalist effort, it is likely that a foothold could have been established, if not a whole colony reclaimed. Instead, London's gaze was firmly affixed on Massachusetts, and the Southern Loyalists were ignored. With the exception of raiding expeditions between Georgian militia and the East Florida garrison, the only official British operation was Henry Clinton's failed opportunistic attack on Charleston in 1776. Consequently, by 1778, the Tidewater and Piedmont were devoid of active loyalists, and the backcountry's numbers were depleted. Following the capture of Savannah, the British fanned out through Georgia. The Continental Southern Department, under Benjamin Lincoln, had previously been concerned with manning the defenses around Charleston, South Carolina, as well as maintaining frontier forts against Cherokee attacks. As such, they were spread too thinly to directly oppose the British in Savannah. However, with Washington's Fabian strategy, they wouldn't need to. Campbell and Brigadier Augustine Prevost were able to seize Augusta by early February. However, they abandoned their conquest on February 12th. While Loyalists were turning out, their numbers were insufficient. The British could only hold territory so long as regulars were present. As soon as they marched off, the Loyalists were immediately overwhelmed by Patriot militia. Lincoln's troops attacked and isolated garrisons and patrols too strong for the militia. Despite Governor Wright's return and July declaration that Georgia was restored to the crown, in reality, the British only controlled Savannah. In an effort to break the stalemate, in April Prevost led his army north, intending to take Charleston. The column was largely unopposed as the local militia fell back, until finally halting and retreating 10 miles from Charleston due to the approach of Lincoln's army after winning a rearguard action at Stono Ferry. Lincoln also wanted to end the stalemate by capturing Savannah, something that would not be possible without naval support. Following the Newport debacle, Francis Comte d'Estaing had left Boston for the Caribbean, France's primary strategic focus. While d'Estaing was willing to aid Lincoln, his orders were to campaign in the Caribbean until the Atlantic hurricane season forced him to leave. In late August, d'Estaing judged that the time had come and sent word to Lincoln that he was en route. Lincoln received the message on September 3rd and moved out on September 8th to meet d'Estaing's 25 ships of the line and 4,000 men, including 500 free men of color from Saint Domingue, modern Haiti. D'Estaing landed south of Savannah on September 12th, and his soldiers began marching on the 16th. Overconfident of victory, d'Estaing demanded the British surrender, then agreed to a 24-hour truce to consider. This delay allowed British reinforcements to arrive with poor communication, with Lincoln's hurried deployments preventing an intercept. On September 19th, French frigates engaged the British in the main channel. Following a withdrawal, most were scuttled to block the French advance. Undeterred, the coalition forces began constructing siege lines, while d'Estaing unloaded cannons from his ships. On October 3rd, the bombardment began. For reasons unclear, the defences were mostly ignored, in favour of hitting the city. By the 8th, it was clear that the bombardment had failed. Frustrated and aware of disease outbreaks in the fleet and the risk of hurricanes making their way up the coast, d'Estaing called a council of war. Unwilling and unable to wait any longer, he ordered an assault, targeting Spring Hill Redoubt on the British right. It would take place the next day. Every officer present argued against it, but d'Estaing refused to listen. It was a disaster. A deserter warned Prevost about the impending attack, and he shifted his defences accordingly. The dawn fog caused the assault force to get lost and disorganized in the swamps and rice fields. By the time the force was actually advancing, the British were well prepared and rested. Despite reaching the British trenches, the assault column was devastated. D'Estaing was wounded twice, while the Continental Cavalry commander, Count Casimir Pulaski, was killed. The coalition suffered 900 casualties to barely 150 for the British. Finally admitting defeat, d'Estaing withdrew to the Caribbean, forcing Lincoln to lift the siege. Back in New York, British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton was surprised by the news. Since Monmouth Courthouse, he and Washington had been effectively probing each other's defenses around New York, while fighting a war of raids and espionage. Clinton was ahead on the visible aspects of this conflict, but Washington would ultimately win thanks to his Culper spy ring, which would thoroughly penetrate British New York. Clinton had started 1779 being highly skeptical of the Southern campaign. He'd committed a minimum of resources to the effort, choosing to make London prove its beliefs in the Loyalists.
The sorry, I'm hold on. I'm about to tell a little story here. It's not a story. The Culper spy ring. The reason why it's called the Culper spy ring is because I believe Washington went by Culper, which isn't why I paused it. The reason, you want to tell? The reason why he went by Culper is because when he was a young boy, 18 or so, he started as a what's it called, Kelby? Surveyor. You didn't help me at all. He started as a surveyor, and he got work surveying property and land in Culper County. And so when they needed a name, the Culper spy ring, when he needed a name, he gave himself that name, because that was, who would know that Washington was a surveyor when he was 18, because now he's in his 40s. Who would have known? Oh, well, he was a surveyor in 20 some years ago. So clearly he surveyed in Culper County, hence he's, no one.
Rather than risk more British soldiers, his skepticism proved correct, as only 1,000 loyalists arrived to bolster Prevost. Beholden to London's orders, Clinton was unable to simply abandon the campaign, but he was also unwilling to support it. Instead, Clinton sought another source of soldiers. In June, Clinton issued the Philipsburg Proclamation, stating that any black person captured aiding the Patriot cause would be immediately sold into slavery, while any slave held by the Patriots that joined the British Army would be freed. While the proclamation cost the British some loyalist support, as many of their slaves fled alongside the intended Patriot slaves, it had the intended effect, and 20,000 slaves would flee to the British during the Southern Campaign. Following the coalition's failure at Savannah, Clinton changed his mind. The South was far more open to invasion than it seemed. Therefore, he recalled the remaining northern garrisons to New York and began planning a new offensive. Charleston would be the target, partially to erase his previous failure, but mostly for strategic reasons. As the fourth largest city in America, Charleston had become the young rebel nation's most important port, and its primary base for the Continental Navy, due to the Royal Navy's presence in the north. If the British could take Charleston, they would shut off the exports keeping the Continental Congress's budget alive. On December 26th, Clinton left New York for Savannah with 14 warships and 8,000 soldiers. Battered by winter storms the whole way south, Clinton arrived off Tybee Island on February 1st. He then waited a week for stragglers to arrive and fresh supplies to be acquired. Lincoln knew of Clinton's arrival and knew Charleston was the target. On paper, the Southern Department had about 5,000 regulars in Charleston, which constituted most of its strength. In reality, only about 1,500 of these men were combat ready due to age and disease. However, their numbers were supplemented by 2,500 militia. In addition, 2 frigates and 6 smaller warships were in the harbour. Expecting Clinton to attack by sea like the first time, Lincoln focused on repairing the defences of Forts Moultrie and Johnson at the harbour mouth, neglecting the landward defences. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. Clinton had learned from his mistakes, and instead of trying to take Charleston by sea, landed 30 miles south of the city on Simmons Island. From there, he paused to call in reinforcements, then proceeded towards Charleston cautiously, building supply depots as he went. On March 20th, the British fleet arrived outside the harbour, with 6 frigates slipping over the sandbar and passed ineffective cannon fire from the forts. The Continental Navy was unprepared for battle, and upon realizing that victory was impossible, scuttled its ships in the Cooper River to block the British advance. Clinton crossed the Ashley River and invested the city on March 29th. Lincoln's lack of preparation allowed Clinton to get within 800 yards of the city before encountering resistance. Realizing that Lincoln still had an escape route over the Cooper, Clinton dispatched the British Legion to seal the city. This legion consisted of 500 enlisted Loyalist light infantry and cavalry and was led by British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. Tarleton accomplished this on April 14th via a surprise cavalry charge on Monk's Corner, the only open route over the Cooper. The militia guarding it routed at the cost of 100 men dead or captured to only 3 wounded legionnaires. Tarleton pulled the same trick on May 6th, seizing Leonard's Ferry, and with it fully encircling Charleston. Lincoln realized that the situation was hopeless by April 21st, but hoped to be allowed to surrender under the honors of war and march out of the city with his army intact. Clinton refused any terms but an unconditional surrender, which Lincoln finally agreed to on May 12th, after British artillery set Charleston alight. It was the worst American defeat of the entire war, with the Continental Army's southern department almost completely destroyed. Following the surrender, about 500 survivors from outlying outposts and late arriving reinforcements began retreating back north. Clinton again dispatched Tarleton to chase them. Taking 270 men, he caught up to them in the Waxhaws region on May 28th, but his forces were too strung out and tired from the hard ride to engage immediately.
The Waxhaw region is where Andrew Jackson was born and raised, future 7th president, and he did not like Tarleton. So I'm guessing when the war, and he was like, 11 when the war happened? Or 8? Anyways, he was captured, but I'm guessing that when the war, like all this fighting that took place here, he got involved. He was a very young boy.
The next day, as the column continued its retreat, Tarleton sent an officer under flag of truce to demand the Americans surrender, mostly to delay them so the rest of his forces could catch up. Knowing that the officer was greatly exaggerating British numbers to intimidate him, the American colonel refused and rearranged his column to prepare for an attack on the rearguard. That attack came at 1500, and the column turned to face the assault. Unfortunately, none of them had ever faced a cavalry charge before, and only managed a single ineffective volley before Tarleton's 170 men smashed through the lines, routing them. What happened next is controversial. Patriots claimed that the Americans attempted to surrender, only for the legionnaires to start indiscriminately slaughtering them. Tarleton claimed he never saw a white flag raised before being trapped under his dead horse. His men, thinking him dead, meted out revenge, causing the carnage. Regardless of the circumstances, over 300 Americans would become casualties to 17 British losses. Following the battle, the Legion would fan out into the countryside, seeking to crush any remaining resistance. Their indiscriminate looting and brutality, coupled with Patriot propaganda over the Waxhaws massacre, earned Tarleton the nickname Bloody Ban.
The Butcher is another one. Tarleton the Butcher. No, the Bloody Butcher. Tarleton the was it the Butcher Bannister? Bloody Butcher? I don't remember. Both of them though.
Clinton returned to New York with half the army on June 5th, leaving Charles Cornwallis in command of the Southern Army. His orders were to complete the pacification of Georgia and South Carolina before taking North Carolina. He did this by dispersing garrisons and patrols throughout the interior while remaining in Charleston. Meanwhile, Washington dispatched his best infantry, the Maryland and Delaware lines, under Horatio Gates, to rescue the situation. The army linked up with Southern survivors at Buffalo Fort, and on July 27th, Gates ordered his 1,500 soldiers to march directly for Camden, South Carolina. This was his first mistake, as the area was devoid of settlements or easy forage, leading to food shortages. During the march south, Virginia and North Carolina militia joined the army, bringing its numbers to 4,000. Here, Gates made his second mistake. He'd not brought more than a token cavalry force, but he declined to add militia cavalry to his army. He also detached some of his regulars to raid British supplies. These decisions left his troops without sufficient scouts. Gates told his aides that he didn't intend to attack the British, and would instead prepare defences north of Camden to force the 1,000-strong British garrison to retreat. Cornwallis learned of Gates's advance on August 9th, and moved from Charleston with 1,100 men to defend Camden. The two armies closed on each other, aware of their presence but oblivious to either's position. On August 15th, both generals ordered night marches to reach their intended defensive positions. At 0200 on the 16th, the vanguards literally ran into each other. After a moment of confusion, both armies separated to wait for dawn. Following British infantry doctrine, both sides formed their lines with their most experienced troops on the right and the least on the left, and a small reserve. This was Gates's third and most egregious mistake, as his inexperienced militia faced the cream of the British army. Gates placed himself behind his reserves, too far to see the battle develop. This would be his final mistake. Both armies advanced, the British leading with bayonets. The Virginia militia had never seen battle before and fled in a panic without firing a shot. A letter told Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson, to "picture it as bad as you possibly can, and it will not be as bad as it really is." The Virginians' panic caused the North Carolinians to also flee, except for those anchored to the Delaware line. Simultaneously, the Continental regulars repelled 2 British charges before counterattacking. The British left would have broken, but for Cornwallis rallying them himself. Then the British right turned, while Tarleton wheeled around the Continental's exposed rear. Realizing the situation, Gates abandoned his army, fleeing 180 miles in 3 days. Boxed in, only a handful of Continentals and the reserve escaped via the swamps. With a second American army destroyed, resistance to Cornwallis collapsed. All remaining Continental forces fled to North Carolina, and the militia dispersed. The only unit still active was Colonel Francis Marion's militia company. Operating out of the Carolina swamps, he harried British supply convoys and frustrated all pursuit, earning the nickname Swamp Fox. Marion prevented the takeover of Williamsburg County, but the rest of the South Carolina Tidewater and Piedmont fell. That accomplished, Cornwallis invaded North Carolina. However, the southern backcountry remained outside his control. To secure this flank, he dispatched Major Patrick Ferguson in May with the local Loyalist militia companies to modern Lincoln County, North Carolina. His orders were to disperse any remaining Patriot resistance and recruit more militia from the backcountry Loyalists to hold the region. This provoked the Over-Mountain Men. These primarily Scotch-Irish frontiersmen from beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains were fiercely anti-British, though until now they'd been entirely concerned with fighting the Cherokee and the Shawnee. Ferguson's approach changed their focus, and the muster was called. On August 18th, 200 Over-Mountain militia ambushed and drove off a mixed force of 500 Loyalist militia and regulars at Musgrove Mill. Ferguson pursued, and the militia fell back over the mountains to Sycamore Shoals. Reinforced with more Over-Mountain militia and 400 Virginia militia, the now 900-strong force set out to confront Ferguson. Ferguson had given up the chase in mid-September, setting camp in Gilberttown, North Carolina, to muster the local Loyalists. When word reached him of the militia's approach, Ferguson decided to withdraw his 1,100 Loyalists to Charlotte and link up with Cornwallis. Rather than push his men to reach Charlotte, he made camp on Kings Mountain and sent a letter to Cornwallis asking for reinforcements. This allowed the Patriots to catch him, marching through the night of October 6th until afternoon on the 7th. At 1500, the Patriots arrived at Kings Mountain. Ferguson was completely unaware of their approach and hadn't fortified his camp. The Patriots quickly and silently surrounded the Loyalists before launching a series of surprise attacks on the summit. Ferguson rallied his men and tried to break out via a bayonet charge, only for the Patriots to withdraw behind the trees and rocks before reopening fire on the exposed Loyalists. This and 2 subsequent charges failed to drive off the Patriots, who were using the angle and cover of the mountain slopes to outshoot the Loyalists. After an hour of fighting, the Loyalists began to surrender. In a final effort to inspire them or possibly escape, Ferguson led one final charge to break through, only to fall to Patriot fire. This led the Loyalists to start surrendering en masse, only for many Patriots to respond, give them Tarleton's quarter, and continue firing. It was only the intervention of the Patriot officers which prevented outright massacre. Kings Mountain was the largest fight between American troops during the war, as only Ferguson was British. The loss of the Loyalist column forced Cornwallis to retreat to Charleston, a bitter end to a successful year, and confirmation that the British could not control the backcountry. Despite a string of decisive British victories, they had failed to put the Americans on the ropes, and the revolution continued. This series will also continue, So, to ensure you don't miss it, make sure...
Yeah, I don't... Hey, stop. It would be difficult, give them Tarleton Quarter. It would be difficult for me to not want to kill all of those guys in revenge, but I would know that that's not the right thing to do. Because if they do it, then we do it, then someone else does it, and it's more people. And what happens if they just take a town and just kill the innocent people in the town? Like, you know, like, when does one-upsmanship stop? When do you just get smart about what you're going to do, and you just don't get involved with that tactic? If it's something that happens continuously, then yeah, I think you have to reconsider, you know, yeah, got to reconsider it. But it would be difficult for me to tell the men to stop. But you got to look to the future and look to the possibility of, what if you and your men are in that situation and you do wave the white flag? You know, you gotta show restraint in those moments. Okay, well, we're gonna end this here. I'm done for the night, though. It is 8:45 and I am tired. So, and I got to mow the grass tomorrow. Yay! So, until next time, have a good day, have a good night.